The other day, I was scrolling through some local clips from Almaty, and one of them really just stood out to me.
Oh, yeah.
It was this young man, couldn't have been more than 20, standing outside a betting shop. It's all lit up with neon, and he has this look of just pure manic triumph.
He hit a big win.
A huge win. He just won the equivalent of 3 months' salary on one football match. And his friends are filming him. He's shouting about how he'd beaten the system, how this was his ticket out.
Right.
And to a casual observer or, maybe a government accountant, this looks like a win-win. The kid gets his money. The state collects its cut. It's a fiscal shortcut to filling the treasury.
A painless tax, in theory.
Exactly. But then the camera pans just slightly to the left, and there's an older woman sitting on a bench just a few feet away. She's staring at a stack of unpaid utility bills, and her face is just a mask of quiet, hollowed-out exhaustion.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
The contrast was so jarring because while he's celebrating this miracle of easy money, you could see the actual fabric of the neighborhood just fraying in real time. The storefronts were peeling, that old industrialist creed of steady, productive work was nowhere in sight, and the whole atmosphere felt heavy with this kind of restless, parasitic energy.
And that perfectly captures the tension at the heart of this whole deep dive. That manic triumph you mentioned, that's the immediate intoxicating promise, quick revenue for the individual, fiscal convenience for the state.
Right.
But the hollowed out exhaustion, that's the long-term cost. And that cost is what some sociologists are now calling civilizational entropy.
Civilizational entropy. That's a heady term. It's not just about lost money, is it? It's something deeper.
It's a gradual decay of the underlying social structures. The things that make a society productive and, cohesive. It's a philosophical and social erosion.
And what's so fascinating is how the Kazakh government originally framed this whole thing. They saw these casinos, these betting apps, as a sign of modernization, a way to harvest revenue without raising taxes.
Physical convenience.
But as you look closer at the social wreckage, this darker picture emerges. That instantaneous shift from seeing a casino as a tax engine to realizing it's actually a negative asset that destroys the disciplined spirit of a nation. That's exactly where Kazakhstan is today.
And it forces a very uncomfortable question.
It does. If a state starts feeding on the compulsive weaknesses of its own citizens just to balance the books, has it stopped governing and started becoming a parasite? Is the ability to prohibit vice actually a higher sign of state capacity than the freedom to permit it?
To really understand that question, we have to ground this local problem in a much bigger macro context. This isn't just happening in Almaty. It's a symptom of a massive globally economic shift that created this vulnerability in the first place, a phenomenon we can call financial parasitism.
Okay, let's unpack that term, financial parasitism, because we were saying the vulnerability we see in that woman on the bench in Kazakhstan is directly tied to these huge global economic structures. Where does a parasitic structure like that even come from?
You really have to look back to the end of the post-war economic boom. So think roughly the early 1970s. Before that, the global economy was dominated by productive industrial capital.
Right. People made things, cars, steel, washing machines.
Exactly. Capitalists made their profits primarily by producing tangible goods. But when that boom started to fizzle out, the profit rates in industrial production just never returned to those historic highs of the 50s and 60s. That traditional productive path became, less lucrative.
So if building factories and making things can no longer deliver the maximum profit returns that capital demands, where does it go? What does it do to keep growing?
It turns, very explicitly, to purely financial methods of accumulation. And that's how we're defining financial parasitism. It's this new structure, really the most rapacious and predatory form of capital. It's profit extraction without any corresponding production of actual goods or services.
So it's less like a factory and more like a really sophisticated filtration system designed to catch wealth that already exists, rather than creating new value.
That's a perfect analogy. And its mechanisms are what have accelerated social inequality to these historically unprecedented levels we see today. We're talking about complex financial instruments, derivatives, sophisticated debt vehicles, none of which are inherently productive. They just function to extract rent from productive activity or existing assets.
You see it with things like massive corporate stock buybacks, right?
That's a very visible mechanism, yes. It enriches shareholders and executives, but does absolutely nothing for a company's long-term industrial capacity or for its workers. It's just siphoning the wealth of society up the income scale, a continuous vacuum effect.
That phrase from the sources, the vampire of fictitious capital, feels very apt. It needs to keep feeding.
It does. And to sustain itself, two indispensable things have to happen on a global scale, and they directly affect the average person. First, the continuous driving down, or at least stagnation, of real wages. This is even while labor productivity is going through the roof.
So people are doing more, creating more value, but they're capturing less and less of it.
Precisely. And the second feature, the intensification of exploitation, which is coupled with the destruction of social services. From the perspective of this financial oligarchy, all social spending, things like healthcare, education, pensions, it's all viewed as a deduction from the surplus value that's available for them to seize.
So you have to shrink the state's productive spending to maximize what's available for financial capture.
You have to.
Okay, so the picture's becoming very clear. Industrial profits slow down, financialization takes over, wages stagnate, and the social safety net is deliberately dismantled. This makes society incredibly brittle, financially fragile.
Hyper-vulnerable.
And that is the context that makes the easy money promise of sports betting and quick gambling so incredibly devastating. It's designed to attack the very fragility that financial parasitism created in the first place.
That's the perfect segue, because we have fresh evidence from a recent U.S. study that shows exactly how this fragility is attacked, especially by the modern online sports betting industry.
This is the study that calls the rush to legalize sports betting since 2018 a gigantic social experiment. Why such a strong term?
Because it was done with, frankly, shockingly little prior evidence about what the societal impact would be. The whole regulatory environment changed overnight with online access.
It's not like the old days where you had to physically drive to a casino or a racetrack. There was a barrier to entry.
Exactly. Now, the state is actively facilitating gambling through an app that is always in your pocket. The big question for regulators was whether legalized online gambling would just divert money people were already spending on, a movie ticket or lottery scratcher.
Or if it would fundamentally attack their core financial stability.
And the findings from this study, Gambling Away Stability, give a very clear answer. One that should be setting off alarm bells for policymakers everywhere, especially in places like Kazakhstan that are looking at this as a source of fiscal convenience.
They should absolutely be alarmed. The study found that legalization doesn't just divert entertainment money at all. It pushes people to overextend their budgets, often at the direct expense of their long-term security. The data points are, well, they're precise and they're brutal. So give us the headline number on that long-term stability piece.
Legalization led to a steep 14% decrease in household deposits in brokerage investment accounts.
14%. And that's not checking accounts for day-to-day spending. These are accounts specifically for investment and savings.
Exactly. That points directly to people either liquidating their long-term wealth or just foregoing building it in the first place.
A 14% drop is a staggering figure. It suggests people aren't just shifting disposable income, they are cutting into their safety nets.
The sheer magnitude of it is underscored by this startling ratio they found. For every single dollar spent on sports betting, net investments decreased by roughly $2.
Wait, $2? How does that work?
It suggests a cascading effect. Maybe the dollar you spend on the bet creates psychological pressure to chase your losses, so you spend more. Or maybe the need for quick cash forces you to pull money from other investment vehicles at a loss. Whatever the reason, the impact is doubled.
So the industry isn't just extracting money, it's actively eroding the very foundation of financial resilience. And I'm guessing this extraction isn't happening equally across the board.
Not even close. And that's the most ethically challenging finding. The study defined a group of households as financially constrained.
So people with lower savings, higher credit card debt, a history of bank overdrafts.
The very group already struggling under the weight of financial parasitism and wage stagnation.
Yes.
And what was the impact on them? This group, the most financially vulnerable, spent a share of their income on sports betting that was 32% higher than the share spent by wealthier, more stable homes.
32% higher. So they're dedicating a third more of their already scarce resources to this incredibly high-risk activity. This isn't a harmless recreational outlet. It's a financial drain that's just making their situation worse.
It creates a self-defeating feedback loop. The state gets its quick revenue, but that gain comes at the cost of its citizens' long-term financial health, which, ultimately increases social risk, future welfare costs, and erodes the productive capacity of the entire workforce.
The short-term fiscal convenience completely undermines the long-term goal of national stability.
Yes.
And this whole scenario of financial parasitism creating household fragility, which is then ruthlessly targeted by easily accessible vice, this is exactly what transition states like Kazakhstan are trying to navigate. So let's shift our focus there to their specific policy failures and the social wreckage it's causing.
When we look at a country like Kazakhstan, the issue is really amplified. Their regulatory frameworks, their data collection capabilities, they often lag way behind the rapid technological changes of the industry.
So the industry moves faster than the government can react.
Much faster. And it offers this substantial, very tempting state revenue. But the trade-off is this exponential growth of addiction, which is leading to profound social and psychological consequences across the entire population.
The sources are pretty clear that despite some recent legislative attempts, the current measures in Kazakhstan to fight this addiction wave are just not enough. What are the key systemic limitations holding them back?
We can break it down to 4 critical gaps. The first one starts with data, or rather the lack of it. There's a fundamental lack of detailed statistical data. They don't use empirical data or predictive analytics. So policymaking becomes reactive. It's based on high-profile anecdotes, like the young man winning big or the older woman losing everything,
instead of comprehensive long-term studies that modern regulation really demands. So they're flying blind, just reacting to crises instead of anticipating them.
Completely flying blind. Which leads to the second limitation, their methods of control. There's an over-reliance on purely punitive methods, fines, short-term jail sentences, prohibitions.
Things that rarely address the root causes of the addiction.
Exactly. The addiction is often rooted in the very financial stress we were just talking about, or the psychological pull of getting rich quick in a stagnant wage economy. Punitive measures just don't keep up with the industry's evolution.
And that evolution brings us to the third point, which is the virtual challenge, right?
Precisely. The third gap is this insufficient attention they're paying to the rapid growth and sophistication of online gambling networks. As soon as the government tries to impose a physical restriction, say, limiting the number of betting shops, the industry just migrates online.
Often operating from offshore or through these complex disguise networks.
We saw that just recently. The Ministry of Internal Affairs and the National Security Committee had to team up to disrupt a major online casino network. It just shows the scale and the virtual complexity of the enforcement challenge they're facing. The moment you contain it physically, it goes virtual.
And that complicates surveillance and control exponentially. So what's the fourth and final gap?
The fourth failure is the inadequate integration of local socio-cultural contexts into their prevention strategies. A good public health approach has to resonate with the specific values and social structures of the Kazakh community.
But their policies feel imported or generic.
They do. They're missing the nuance you need to make prevention efforts relatable or, truly effective for the people they're supposed to be serving.
This all suggests that Kazakhstan isn't just dealing with a rogue industry. They're facing a strategic crisis. They need a competitive, systematic strategy that moves beyond just punishment and anecdotes. What does a shift like that actually look like in practice?
It's multifaceted. It really focuses on 3 core areas. First, they have to strengthen the legislative framework specifically to deal with the technological complexity and the international nature of these online operations.
So their regulatory reach has to extend beyond their own borders and physical locations.
It has to. And secondly, on transparency, they need to drastically increase industry transparency and accountability. We're talking about real-time, mandatory reporting on key metrics, problem gambler identification, deposit limits, payout ratios. They need to move away from letting the industry regulate itself.
That transparency seems key to building public trust and ensuring the revenue the state claims it's getting is accurately measured against the true social cost.
It's essential. And finally, they need to move from being reactive to actually getting into prevention. They need to introduce effective, systematic prevention programs that are culturally informed.
Which means taking some of that gambling tax revenue and putting it back into public mental health and dedicated addiction treatment.
A significant portion of it, yes.
Yeah.
The policy has to be built on accurate, reliable, and holistic information.
What's really at stake here if a country like Kazakhstan fails to make this kind of strategic shift? We mentioned civilizational entropy earlier, but let's connect that directly to their economic output.
The stake is their entire national productive capacity. The analysis suggests that only a comprehensive, culturally informed strategy can foster societal well-being and economic stability. If the state keeps allowing financial parasitism, like the gambling industry, to flourish at the expense of family stability, it's risking its own long-term economic future.
So protecting the family unit from financial ruin isn't just a welfare issue. You're saying it's a core economic necessity.
It's viewed as a prerequisite for maintaining national productivity and for ensuring intergenerational upward mobility. Think about it. When households are decimated by debt, their children's educational opportunities suffer. The workforce is destabilized by stress. The capacity for long-term saving and investment, the very things that fuel productive capital, it all just vanishes.
Failure here leads directly to that civilizational decadence.
It does. A result-oriented government has to prioritize physical industrial output and that industrialist creed over these short-term fiscal gains.
That's a profound contrast. A state defined by its ability to extract revenue versus a state defined by its ability to safeguard the stability of its citizens. To see how a state can try to navigate this over a long period, we need a comparative model. So let's turn to Singapore and their decades-long, very intentional policy of trying to tame vice.
Singapore provides such a rich history here because their efforts to manage gambling started way back in the colonial era, long before modern technology. They developed these highly specific legal, spatial, and even aesthetic controls to rationalize an activity they often condemned in public.
Let's start there. In the colonial period in Malaya, the British administrators had this difficult moral and political problem with gambling. You mentioned the Orientalist paradox. What was that exactly?
Well, the paradox came from the prevailing colonial ideology. British administrators, influenced by these Orientalist views, often characterized gambling as a vice natural to the Chinese race.
Okay, so if you believe that, how can you criminalize the activity without turning the entire population into criminals and basically delegitimizing your own rule?
Exactly, and they needed the revenue. They relied heavily on Chinese capitalists to run profitable opium and gambling revenue farms to finance the empire. So they came up with this strange, uneven geography of legality to manage that contradiction.
And the solution was spatial.
Yes, driven by the Common Gaming House Ordinance. It defined criminality not by the universal act of gambling, but by the physical space where it happened. So gambling was tolerated and taxed in certain designated revenue farms, which were often these brutal, high-stakes places. But it was totally criminalized in large, independent commercial dens or underground lottery headquarters.
What's so fascinating in the sources is how this spatial definition meant that architecture itself became part of the legal reasoning. How did physical features become legal evidence of a crime?
The law essentially outsourced part of its enforcement to the building structure. Suspicious architectural features like trapdoors for a quick escape or unusually narrow passageways designed to slow down a police raid were seen by the courts as an automatic confession of criminal intent.
So a building found with features like that was automatically deemed a common gaming house under the law until you could prove otherwise.
The building itself became the primary witness. It's a fascinating legal maneuver.
But how did the colonial state deal with the more invisible forms of gambling, like the illegal lotteries that didn't rely on a fixed architecturally defined den?
This is where the state had to develop what the sources call legibility. The gambling networks, especially lotteries like Waisang and Entropy, use very sophisticated subterfuge to avoid getting caught. So the colonial state had to rely heavily on cultural experts, specifically sinologists. There was one named George Hare who was a vital translator and decoder for them.
What kinds of things was he translating for the police?
Hare's work detailed the semiotics of the illegal gambling world. So for Waisang, for instance, tickets weren't sold as tickets. They were disguised as something innocuous, like a newspaper, or they were claimed to be goods or charity subscriptions. It created layers of plausible deniability.
And what about chapchiki?
That one was wildly popular, especially among straight Chinese women. They often used obscure animal symbols or strings of colored beads or other everyday objects as their numerical system. It left very few material traces that police who are unfamiliar with the cultural code could possibly interpret.
So Hare provided the key. He gave them the knowledge to decipher these disguises in advance, which turned the police from simple enforcers into cultural detectives.
It made enforcement possible. They could find the criminals, seize the evidence that was disguised as everyday material, and connect the act to the space, which was the legal requirement. And this colonial strategy really laid the groundwork for Singapore's later obsession with total control and visibility.
Okay, so let's fast forward to post-colonial Singapore after the 1960s. Their nation-building project was intense. They wanted to purge colonial influences and create a very specific national character, a clean and rugged society.
That's right. The state sought to reform man by reforming the environment. They had those famous campaigns against yellow culture, targeting hippieism, drug use, and of course gambling. It was seen as a sinful, wasteful habit that undermined the disciplined workforce they needed for modernization.
They actually intensified the criminalization of gambling, far beyond what the British had done.
They did, which brings us to the ultimate contradiction. The decision to legalize the public lottery, Singapore pools, for purely pragmatic purposes. Suddenly they had to justify why the state was exploiting the very natural weakness they'd spent years trying to eradicate.
And the justification was just pragmatism over ideology.
Explicitly. The state recognized that gambling was an ineradicable part of human nature. So since people were going to gamble anyway, the goal was to divert the massive amount of money being spent on illegal operations, which was enriching criminal syndicates, directly into state coffers to finance public goods.
And the first symbolic target for that money was the National Stadium.
Right. And to manage this moral contradiction, profiting from the vice they were purging, the state had to make the conversion of bad money to good money visible, disciplined, and above all else, boring. This was their famous aesthetic performance of justice.
A highly managed performance.
Very. It evolved over time to become more and more rigid. At first, some public draws were held in shopping centers. They had a slightly carnivalesque feel, but they always required this visual and bodily discipline to assure the public of the process's integrity. The state had to convey total control.
And once the National Stadium project was complete, the government felt they couldn't be seen to excite and exploit this natural weakness anymore. What was the key aesthetic shift that happened then?
The carnivalesque elements were completely purged. After 1978, the results announcement was moved from television to radio. The clear intention was to actively discourage public excitement, to move the whole operation toward an atmosphere of almost clinical invisibility and silence.
So the ritual itself became more regimented, almost scientific.
Extremely. It was conducted by government officials and external auditors, emphasizing methodical restraint and certainty over any kind of euphoric hope or chance.
The state used this deliberately dry, austere aesthetic to translate their policy principle of only catering to unstimulated demand. And this disciplined conversion was actually built into the architecture of the National Stadium.
Absolutely. The building was the symbol that closed the circle of this alchemy. They chose the brutalist, form-bare concrete, massive geometric intensity, specifically to express size and strength. Brutalism, at its core, emphasizes the collective, the state, the permanent institution, over the ephemeral individual.
So it symbolized the conversion of individual weakness, the gambling loss into national discipline, collective infrastructure, a productive workforce.
Exactly.
This whole history of spatial containment and aesthetic control contrasts so sharply with the next phase of our story. The global casino industry's adoption of the Las Vegas model, which turned vice into a pure science of quantification.
The Las Vegas model, especially after the 1960s, didn't just see vice as a revenue source. It embraced it as an object of rigorous scientific study. And the big technological upheaval that made this possible was the electronic slot machine revolution.
How did the slot machine change the economics of the industry so fundamentally?
Well, historically, gambling was limited by how many people could sit at a table or by clunky mechanical slot machines. But with electronic slots innovations like IGT's Megabucks, which could link jackpots across state lines, the industry scaled massively. And crucially, the slot machine stopped being just a mechanical game of chance. It became a sophisticated networked data collection device.
And this quantitative turn helped legitimize the industry.
Yes, through what the sources call an avalanche of printed numbers. Rigorous accounting, quantifiable metrics like win rates, house edge, player duration, all of this was used to create an illusion of objectivity and certainty. It challenged that old specter of criminality and corruption. For regulators and investors, gambling was transformed from a shady backroom operation into a measurable, predictable business model.
And this quantification went right down to the individual player level, creating an automated surveillance system.
Exactly. The casino no longer had to rely just on physical surveillance or intuition. Slot technology enabled an automated surveillance system where the player and all their activity was just disassembled into streams of virtual data.
Every card swipe, every bet size, every pause between spins.
All of it was captured. And this data stream was constantly analyzed for profit maximization. It allowed the casino to identify high-value targets, predict behavior, even tailor comps and experiences to keep players engaged and playing longer.
It sounds like the industry could see a future where almost every economic activity inside the resort could be absorbed into this virtual superstructure of numbers, making the entire environment a predictable engine of extraction.
That was precisely the goal. And to implement this, a new profession emerged: the casino designer. These weren't just architects, they were experts who claimed to translate these streams of numbers, the quantitative data, back into physical space and emotional triggers.
So how does the science of casino design connect the numbers with emotions and space?
They formalized design into a profit-maximizing template, much like the rigid design principles of a successful shopping mall. For instance, they maximize profit by placing the casino floor centrally, often without clear external markers like windows or clocks to make the player lose track of time.
They control the traffic flow.
Intentionally, they ensure that even if you're going to the hotel or the shops, you have to filter through the gaming floor. It maximizes incidental exposure and reinforces the sense that this is a 24/7 ecosystem built entirely around optimized extraction. This shift to the multifunctional casino resort ultimately defeated the old idea of physical confinement and really set the stage for virtual expansion.
And it was this hyper-rationalized, scientific Las Vegas model that Singapore had to confront when they made that dramatic decision in 2005 to legalize large-scale casino gambling.
Right. They knew they needed the revenue, but they absolutely could not compromise their national aesthetic or the decades of moral puritanism they'd built.
So they created the integrated resort, the IR.
Which was a deliberate act of sanitization. It wasn't branded as a casino. It was a large-scale, world-class complex, luxury hotels, high-end retail convention centers, where the gaming component only took up about 3 to 5% of the total physical area. It was designed to hide the vice in plain sight.
Given what a massive reversal this was for them, how did the government ensure transparency and objectivity in the bidding process to avoid accusations of corruption?
They used very sophisticated quantitative tools, notably something called the analytic hierarchy process, or AHP. This was a complex mathematical framework designed to maintain transparency. So instead of just a subjective judgment of which design looked best, AHP forced developers to address comprehensive pre-weighed criteria.
Can you elaborate on that? What kind of criteria were they weighing with the AHD?
Well, AHP is a structured technique for organizing complex decisions. It assigns relative weights to different criteria and then scores proposals against those weights. So in the IR case, the criteria went way beyond just financial viability. They weighed architectural impact, urban fit, environmental sustainability metrics, job creation potential, even the quality of the developer's proposed MIC facilities. That's meetings, incentives, conventions, and exhibitions.
So by using this complex, almost scientific process, the government was signaling to the public that the decision wasn't arbitrary, it was a calculated outcome.
Precisely. They were trying to demonstrate a commitment to due process, to ensure that, as one source put it, you cannot play the system. But beneath this veneer of objective analysis, there's a jarring contradiction that was revealed by the financial projections.
And that contradiction was the huge gap between the physical footprint of the casino and how much money it was actually bringing in.
The figures were just impossible to ignore. Despite the casino component being just 3 to 5% of the total square footage, financial projections showed it contributed a staggering 81% of the total revenue.
81%.
81%. This harsh fact just fundamentally undermined the official story that the IR was mainly about tourism and conventions. It exposed the entire project as being fundamentally reliant on gambling profits.
So if the profits were so glaringly dependent on the vice, the state had to work even harder on the aesthetic contract to make sure the resort fulfilled the national vision as a modern icon and not the gaudy, fire-spouting pyramid that the government had explicitly rejected.
And this is where the government planners intervened architecturally, often against the developer's immediate profit interests. The initial proposal from Las Vegas Sands, who won the bid, was dramatically reshaped. The government insisted on public features that served a pedagogical or civic purpose.
The most iconic example being the Moshe Safdie-designed Sky Park that connects the 3 hotel towers at Marina Bay Sands.
It's the ultimate symbol of this aesthetic contract. That Sky Park is a public space, funded by Vice money, but designed to fulfill a very specific civic and pedagogical role. You're perched 57 stories high, and it gives you this comprehensive synoptic view of the city, a vantage point that's usually reserved for city planners or ruling elites.
And what's the pedagogical function of that view?
An audio guide directs you to identify key landmarks, contrasting the old city layout with the new, projecting this image of continuous, planned national development. The architecture literally transforms bad money into this magical platform for appreciating national progress. And by framing the city as this success story of planning and discipline, it hides the 81% revenue-generating casino floor located far beneath your feet. It fulfills the state's desire to remain the ultimate guardian of the collective vision.
This journey from colonial police decoding secret lottery codes to a modern state building a sky park to disguise a casino's revenue stream. It just shows this continuous, highly intentional effort to control the moral and spatial boundaries of vice. And this brings us back finally to that initial uncomfortable question. What does the decision to permit or prohibit vice tell us about the ultimate definition of state capacity?
This final analysis really forces a philosophical contrast. We've seen the model, which is primarily prevalent in Western liberal economies, that permits vice for fiscal convenience. Now we have to contrast that with a model that views the suppression of vice as a superior sign of strength, often rooted in the philosophy of what's called the civilization state.
Let's dedicate some time to defining that concept, the Chinese civilization state, because we usually talk about state legitimacy in terms of the Westphalian nation-state model, defined by territorial sovereignty, legal treaties. How does the civilization state differ?
Well, the civilization state derives its legitimacy not primarily from legal treaties or borders, but from the continuation of a deep historical socio-political order. The state positions itself fundamentally as the guardian of its citizens and of the long-term integrity of their society and culture. This is a legitimacy that spans millennia, not just decades.
That concept of the state as a guardian is a dramatic shift. It moves the purpose of governance away from simply facilitating free markets or collecting taxes. It elevates the collective survival of the social order.
It does. And the key features of this model reflect its deep history. It relies on maintaining a strong ethos of cultural unity, despite often encompassing vast geography and significant diversity. It's inexorably tied to the past. The sources highlight the longevity and continuous use of the Chinese writing system as a specific feature of this deep continuity. This model prioritizes the long-term stability and moral order of the society over any short-term political or fiscal gains.
So when you apply that philosophical lens, the state as the guardian of a continuous multi-millennial civilization, back to the question of gambling and financial parasitism, the governing conclusion is radically different from the one that drove legalization in the US or in early Kazakhstan.
Absolutely. The sources strongly suggest an Eastern model of civilizational resilience that views the suppression of vice industries as a superior form of governance. The logic is simple and direct. Allowing an industry that relies on the compulsive weaknesses of its citizens is a form of state-sponsored self-sabotage. It compromises the entire national project.
And this links morality directly back to economic policy in a very pragmatic way. It connects household health to national industrial strength.
Exactly. Under this philosophy, protecting the family unit from financial ruin isn't viewed as just a humanitarian gesture. It is considered a prerequisite for maintaining national productivity and intergenerational upward mobility. If the bedrock of your national economy, the households, are brittle, indebted, and psychologically addicted, the state's capacity to drive physical industrial output is severely compromised.
In other words, you cannot be a great industrial power if your citizens are economically enslaved by gambling debt.
Correct. Result-oriented governance, under this paradigm, demands a very clear prioritization. It has to prioritize physical industrial output and adhere to the industrialist creed, the belief in steady, productive, tangible work over the seductive short-term revenues offered by financial parasitism, like the gambling industry.
And failure to do so risks civilizational decadence or entropy.
Precisely. So the ability to just say no to profitable vice is viewed as a higher indicator of true governance strength than the sophisticated ability to regulate and sanitize it, like Singapore tried to do, or to simply extract revenue from it, as Kazakhstan initially did. True state capacity isn't just measured by the efficiency of tax collection, but by the state's ability to guide the moral and financial behavior of its citizens toward long-term collective prosperity.
So we've spent this deep dive navigating a complex philosophical contest that's really hidden inside the seemingly simple policy question of whether to legalize gambling.
We started with that jarring visual in Almaty, the young man's manic triumph versus the older woman's hollowed-out exhaustion. And we traced that back to the global economic impulse of financial parasitism, which drives states to seek fiscal convenience by aggressively targeting their most vulnerable households.
Then we saw how two different states managed this impulse. In Kazakhstan, the reliance on reactive, punitive measures proved completely insufficient against the rapid virtual growth of the industry.
And in Singapore, we analyzed a multi-decade effort of spatial and aesthetic engineering, from the colonial paradox to the brutalist national stadium and the transparent yet revenue-dependent integrated resort, all designed to rationalize the conversion of bad money to good money without compromising that disciplined national aesthetic.
Ultimately, this whole discussion clarifies that the debate over gambling legalization is, at its heart, a profound philosophical contest over the very definition of true state capacity. Is governance defined by its efficiency in extracting revenue from its citizens' weaknesses, or is it defined by its ability to act as the effective guardian of its citizens' long-term stability and moral order, prioritizing the preservation of a productive society over short-term fiscal gain?